It was an unseasonably warm day in early April 2023 when Officer Dan Carter parked his cruiser in front of a modest white brick house on Elm Street in Brooklyn. At 35 years old, Dan was a seasoned officer with the NYPD and a man with few personal attachments. His one-bedroom apartment in Queens was tidy but sterile, a reflection of the solitude he had grown accustomed to. His partner and best friend, Officer James Jimmy Hall, lived a different life altogether. At 36 years old, Jimmy had a family, a loving wife named Sarah, 33 years old, and a rambunctious 5-year-old son, Tommy. Their home exuded warmth, the kind of warmth that came from years of shared memories and steadfast love. To Dan, their life was a picture of everything he hadn't found for himself. Dan knocked on the door, and Sarah answered, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She smiled warmly, the way she always did when she saw him. "Dan, come in," she said, stepping aside. "Thanks, Sarah," he replied, stepping into the familiar space. "Jimmy around?" "He's out back with Tommy," she said. "Why don't you head out there? I'll grab you a drink." Dan thanked her and made his way to the backyard, where Jimmy was tossing a baseball to Tommy. The little boy's laughter echoed across the yard as he chased after the ball. Jimmy looked up when he saw Dan and grinned. "Hey, partner. You're just in time to see Tommy's fastball," Jimmy called out, tossing the ball to his son again. Dan laughed, joining the scene effortlessly. He spent the next hour playing catch with Tommy, joking with Jimmy, and soaking in the easy rhythm of family life. Dan's visits became more frequent over the next few weeks, and not just after work or on weekends. It started innocently. He dropped by to pick up Jimmy for a shift or to return something borrowed. But soon, he was staying for dinner more often than not, his presence a welcome addition to the family's routine. "Tommy loves it when you're here," Sarah said one evening as she cleared the table. "He talks about his Uncle Dan all the time." Dan smiled, watching as Tommy zoomed around the living room with a toy plane. "He's a great kid," he said. "You and Jimmy are doing a good job with him." Jimmy grinned, clapping Dan on the back. "Maybe we'll get you set up with a family of your own someday, huh?" Dan chuckled but didn't answer. The truth was, he found himself lingering in their home for reasons he couldn't quite admit, even to himself. It wasn't just about Tommy's infectious laughter or Jimmy's easy camaraderie. It was Sarah. Sarah had a natural warmth that drew people in. She never complained about Jimmy's long hours or the stress of his dangerous job, even though Dan could see the toll it took on her. Over time, Dan began noticing the little things, how Sarah brushed her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, how she hummed softly while cooking, how she always seemed to know exactly what everyone needed without being asked. He told himself it was just admiration, the same way he admired Jimmy for his loyalty and dedication. But admiration began to twist into something deeper, something more complicated as the months passed. By June, Dan was practically a fixture in the Hall household. Jimmy would joke that they should start charging him rent, and Sarah would laugh, playfully reminding him that she didn't mind cooking for one more. One evening, as the summer heat pressed against the windows, the three of them sat on the porch while Tommy played with his action figures in the yard. "You've been around a lot lately, Dan," Jimmy said, sipping a beer. "Not that I'm complaining. Sarah loves the help with Tommy, and I think he's decided you're cooler than me." Dan chuckled, taking a sip of his own drink. "I just like spending time here." "Well, you're welcome anytime," Sarah said with a smile. "It's nice having you around, and Tommy really does adore you." Dan nodded, his heart tugging at the sight of her smile. He turned his attention back to Tommy, watching the boy's carefree movements, but his thoughts lingered on Sarah. He never acted on the feelings that began to grow. He never said a word to Sarah, never crossed any lines. But his visits became less about spending time with Jimmy and more about being near her. He found himself lingering over conversations, offering to help with small tasks, and watching her out of the corner of his eye when he thought no one was looking. Jimmy didn't notice. He was a good husband, but his long hours on the force and his easy trust in Dan left him blind to the subtle shifts in his friend's behavior. And Sarah, if she noticed Dan's attention, she gave no indication. She remained kind and warm, treating him like the brother her husband so often called him. But for Dan, every visit left him feeling more conflicted. He knew what he was feeling wasn't right, that it was a betrayal of the man who trusted him more than anyone. Yet he couldn't stay away. As summer deepened and the days grew longer, Dan's presence in the Hall household became almost routine. And while he told himself he was there for Tommy, for Jimmy, or just for the companionship, A part of him knew the truth. He was there for Sarah. By late July 2023, the oppressive summer heat blanketed Brooklyn, making the air feel thick and heavy. Dan Carter was at the Hall household again, as he often was, sitting on the back porch with Jimmy while Tommy splashed around in a small, inflatable pool. Sarah had just stepped inside to grab more lemonade, and Dan found himself watching her through the kitchen window. "She's one of a kind, huh?" Jimmy said suddenly, a proud smile on his face. Dan snapped his attention back to his partner. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet. "She is." Jimmy chuckled, oblivious to the weight behind Dan's words. "I got lucky with her. Don't know how I pulled it off, honestly." Dan managed a weak smile, but guilt churned in his gut. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. A week later, the storm finally broke. Jimmy was called in for an unexpected double shift, leaving Sarah and Tommy at home. Dan hadn't planned on visiting that night, but something compelled him to stop by. Sarah greeted him at the door, surprised but not displeased to see him. "Jimmy's at work," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "But you're welcome to stay for a bit." "Tommy's just gone to bed." Dan hesitated on the threshold before stepping inside. The house was quiet, the usual hum of family life muted without Jimmy or Tommy's presence. Sarah led him to the living room, where they sat on opposite ends of the couch, a glass of wine in each of their hands. For a while, they talked about the usual things: Tommy's latest adventures, the demands of Jimmy's job, and Sarah's graphic design projects. But as the conversation lulled, an uneasy silence settled between them. Dan set his glass down, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he shouldn't say it, but the words were clawing at his throat, desperate to be let out. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and uneven. She looked up, her expression curious but calm. "What is it, Dan?" He hesitated, searching her face for any sign that she might already know. But she didn't. She was as open and kind as ever, and that made what he was about to say feel even more wrong. "I think I need to be honest with you," he said finally, his hands gripping his knees. I think I've fallen for you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shattering the easy familiarity that had always existed between them. Sarah's expression froze, her eyes widening in shock. "Dan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know it's wrong," he continued, rushing to fill the silence. "I know you love Jimmy, and I never want to come between you two. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. It's been eating me alive." Sarah stared at him, her emotions swirling just beneath the surface: shock, anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. She set her glass down carefully, as if afraid of breaking it, and folded her hands in her lap. "Dan," she said again, more firmly this time, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. I needed you to know. I needed to get it off my chest." Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze steady but filled with pain. "Dan, I care about you. You're like family to us. But I love my husband. I love Jimmy more than anything in this world. And whatever you're feeling, it can't go any further than this conversation." Her words were like a knife to his chest, but Dan nodded. He had known this would be her response, had prepared himself for it. But hearing it still hurt more than he expected. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant to make you uncomfortable." Sarah shook her head, her expression softening. "I'm not angry, Dan. But this has to stop. You've always been welcome here because you're Jimmy's best friend, because we trust you. But if this is going to jeopardize that, I need you to take a step back. For everyone's sake." Dan felt a lump rising in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "I understand," he said quietly. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them both. Finally, Dan stood, forcing himself to meet her eyes one last time. "I'll go," he said. Sarah nodded, standing as well. "Good night, Dan." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt like the end of something he hadn't been ready to let go of. Over the next few days, Dan avoided the Hall household. He stopped dropping by for dinner, stopped answering Jimmy's calls with excuses about being busy or needing space. Jimmy, confused but trusting, didn't push. Sarah, meanwhile, said nothing to her husband about Dan's confession. She told herself it was because she didn't want to upset him, that there was no point in creating a rift between them over something that had already been resolved. But deep down, she couldn't shake the guilt she felt for not seeing the signs, for allowing Dan to get close enough to feel this way. Dan, for his part, tried to throw himself into his work, but the image of Sarah's face, her voice as she gently but firmly turned him away, haunted him. He had been a fool to think she might feel the same, but the ache in his chest refused to fade. The bond that had once tied the three of them together so tightly had been strained, and though none of them realized it yet, it would never fully recover. August 2023 brought no relief from the summer heat, and with it came a suffocating weight that settled in Dan Carter's chest. Days had turned into weeks since his confession to Sarah, and he hadn't been back to the Hall household. The distance was supposed to help, give him time to move on, to rebuild the boundaries he'd crossed. But instead, it gave him time to think. And his thoughts had grown darker. Alone in his sparse apartment, Dan would replay every interaction with Sarah in his mind. Her laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about her family, the warmth in her voice when she called him Uncle Dad. She was everything he had ever wanted. It tore him apart to know she wasn't his, and likely never would be. At first, he had accepted her rejection, telling himself he'd stay away for the sake of their friendship, for the sake of Tommy. But the more he thought about it, the more a poisonous idea began to take root. It wasn't Sarah who was the problem. It was Jimmy. Jimmy was the one who stood in the way of everything Dan wanted. If Jimmy weren't in the picture, maybe Sarah would see him differently. Maybe she would realize how much better he could treat her, how much more he understood her than Jimmy ever could. The thought terrified Dan at first, the mere idea of hurting his best friend feeling like a betrayal of everything he stood for. But as the days passed, it began to feel less like a betrayal and more like inevitability. One evening, as Dan sat at his kitchen table, nursing a whiskey, his phone buzzed. It was Jimmy. Dan, man, where have you been? Jimmy's voice was light, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Sarah and Tommy miss you. Hell, I miss you. You've been acting weird lately. Everything okay? Dan clenched his jaw, the sound of Jimmy's voice grating against his nerves. Yeah, just busy, he said shortly. Well, clear your schedule, Jimmy said, oblivious to Dan's tone. Sarah's planning a barbecue this weekend. Nothing fancy, just us and a couple of neighbors. You're coming, right? Dan hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't planned on seeing Sarah or Jimmy again so soon. But the idea of being close to her, even if only for a few hours, was too tempting to resist. Yeah, he said finally. I'll be there. The barbecue was a lively affair, the smell of grilled meat mixing with the laughter of children playing in the yard. Dan arrived late, his eyes immediately searching for Sarah. She was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a fruit salad. Dan, she said, startled but not unfriendly. I wasn't sure you'd come. Jimmy insisted, he said with a small smile. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Well, it's good to see you. Throughout the afternoon, Dan stayed close to Sarah, offering to help her with food, carrying trays out to the yard, and even playing referee for Tommy and his friends. Jimmy noticed nothing unusual, too caught up in flipping burgers and chatting with their neighbors. But as the day wore on, Dan's resentment simmered beneath the surface. Watching Jimmy laugh and joke with Sarah, seeing the easy affection between them, only deepened his conviction. Jimmy didn't deserve her. That night, as Dan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the idea that had been haunting him for weeks solidified into a plan. Jimmy needed to be removed, not permanently, but enough to give Dan a chance. Enough to make Sarah see that she didn't need Jimmy, that she had someone better waiting for her. Dan knew he couldn't do anything obvious. Jimmy was his partner on the force, and any suspicion would fall on him first. But there were other ways to destroy a man, ways that didn't involve blood or violence. Jimmy's job was dangerous. All it would take was a little manipulation, a small nudge in the wrong direction. It was a terrible thought, and part of Dan hated himself for even considering it. But the other part, the part that burned with jealousy and longing, told him it was the only way. The following week, Dan began putting his plan into motion. He started paying closer attention during their shifts, watching for opportunities to put Jimmy in harm's way without raising suspicion. It wasn't easy. Jimmy was a good cop, sharp and cautious, and their precinct was relatively quiet that month. But Dan was patient. He knew the perfect moment would come eventually. It was just a matter of time. Meanwhile, he began visiting the Hall household again, slowly easing back into their lives. Jimmy welcomed him with open arms, grateful to have his best friend back. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed more guarded. She was polite but distant, and Dan could sense her discomfort whenever they were alone. Still, he pressed on, telling himself it was for her own good. Once Jimmy was out of the picture, she would see that he was the one who truly cared for her, the one who could make her happy. By the end of August, Dan was more determined than ever. The bond he had once shared with Jimmy felt like a distant memory, replaced by a cold calculation. He told himself that he wasn't betraying his friend. Jimmy had everything, and Dan had nothing. This wasn't about malice. It was about balance, about taking what he deserved. But deep down, Dan knew the truth. He was about to cross a line he could never come back from. And once he did, none of their lives would ever be the same. The crisp September night was unusually quiet, with a hum of New York City's chaos dulled by the late hour. Dan Carter's fingers gripped the steering wheel of his black sedan as he followed Jimmy Hall's car down a stretch of lonely highway outside Brooklyn. Their shift had ended an hour ago, and Jimmy had insisted on driving separately after they'd finished paperwork at the precinct. Dan had made sure of it. The plan had been forming in his mind for weeks, and now, with the road ahead dark and empty, it felt like fate had given him the perfect opportunity. His heart pounded as his headlights illuminated the silver sedan ahead of him, Jimmy's car, moving steadily toward the curve in the road where Dan planned to make his move. Jimmy was oblivious, humming along to the radio as his car cruised along the highway. He was tired but content, looking forward to getting home to Sarah and Tommy. His thoughts drifted to the barbecue they were planning for the weekend, Sarah's laughter, and Tommy's excitement over a new set of Legos. Dan, following close behind, knew exactly what Jimmy was thinking. He'd spent years listening to Jimmy talk about his perfect family, his perfect life. And now, as Dan watched the taillights of Jimmy's car glow in the darkness, a cold determination settled over him. Jimmy didn't deserve it. As they approached a sharp bend in the road, Dan pressed the gas pedal, his car surging forward. He closed the distance between them quickly, his pulse pounding in his ears. The bend was surrounded by dense trees, with a steep embankment on the other side. If a car went off the road here, it wouldn't be found until morning. Dan's hands tightened on the wheel as he pulled up alongside Jimmy's car. For a moment, he hesitated, his conscience warring with his jealousy. But then he saw Sarah's face in his mind, her laugh, her kindness, the way she made him feel like he belonged. This was for her. With a sudden jerk of the wheel, Dan veered sharply to the right, slamming into the side of Jimmy's car. Jimmy's car swerved violently, his hands scrambling to regain control. "What the hell?" he shouted, his heart racing as he fought to keep the car on the road. Dan didn't let up. He hit Jimmy's car again, harder this time, and watched as the vehicle skidded toward the guardrail. The sound of screeching tires and crunching metal filled the air as Jimmy's car broke through the barrier, flipping end over end down the embankment. Dan slammed on his brakes, his car skidding to a halt a few yards down the road. His hands shook as he sat there, staring at the broken guardrail. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of Jimmy's car crashing through the trees below. For a moment, Dan considered calling for help. But then he remembered the plan, the weeks of building up to this moment. He couldn't stop now. If anyone suspected he'd been involved, it would all be over. He pulled his car back onto the road and drove off, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't look back. Jimmy's car was found the next morning by a passing driver. It was crumpled at the bottom of the embankment, a mangled wreck of metal and shattered glass. The responding officers noted the broken guardrail and concluded it had been a tragic accident, likely caused by Jimmy falling asleep at the wheel or swerving to avoid an animal. At the precinct, the news hit like a bombshell. Jimmy Hall, the beloved officer, the family man, was gone. Dan played his part perfectly, his grief convincing as he consoled his colleagues and stood by Sarah's side during the funeral. Sarah was a wreck, her face pale and hollow as she clung to Tommy. Dan stayed close to her, offering quiet words of comfort and helping her with the endless logistics that followed Jimmy's death. Inside, he told himself he'd done the right thing. Jimmy was gone, and now Sarah could finally see him for what he was, the man who truly cared for her, the man who could be there for her in ways Jimmy never could. But as he stood by the grave, watching Sarah cry, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that this wasn't over. In the weeks following Jimmy's death, Dan became Sarah's rock. She leaned on him for support, grateful for his unwavering presence. He took on tasks that Jimmy had always handled, helped with Tommy when needed, and ensured that Sarah never felt alone. Slowly but surely, a closeness began to develop between them. Sarah's grief was overwhelming, but in her weakest moments, Dan was there, steady, reliable, and kind. His comfort felt natural, even soothing, as though he were the only one who truly understood the void left behind. And while she couldn't admit it to herself, her reliance on Dan began to shift into something more. By late October, their interactions carried an undercurrent of unspoken tension. Sarah noticed the way Dan looked at her, the way his hand would linger on her shoulder, or how his voice softened when he spoke to her. One evening, after a long day of managing Tommy and sorting through Jimmy's belongings, Sarah broke down. Dan, as always, was there. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently, sitting beside her on the couch. "I don't know how to do it without him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Dan hesitated before placing a hand over hers. "You're stronger than you think. And I'll be here. For you and Tommy. Always." In that moment, Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just her late husband's best friend, but a man who had been a constant source of strength. Overcome with emotion, she leaned forward, pressing her lips to his. Dan froze, his heart pounding as the kiss deepened, but when Sarah pulled away, a mix of guilt and confusion flickered across her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, standing abruptly. "I shouldn't have." "Sarah," Dan interrupted, reaching for her hand. "It's okay." He stopped himself, unsure how to articulate everything he wanted to say. "I care about you. More than you know." The words hung in the air as Sarah stepped back, her breath shaky. "I can't do this. Not now." Dan nodded, understanding but unable to shake the hope that had ignited within him. While Sarah and Dan wrestled with their emotions, the NYPD launched an internal investigation into Jimmy's death. The circumstances of the crash had been deemed unusual. Jimmy was a seasoned officer and a careful driver. When surveillance footage from a nearby traffic camera surfaced, it showed Dan's car following Jimmy's on the highway that night. The precinct's captain called Dan in for questioning. "You didn't mention you were driving behind Jimmy that night," the captain said, his tone neutral but sharp. Dan's pulse quickened. "I didn't think it was relevant. I left work a few minutes after him, but we didn't interact. Strange coincidence, don't you think?" The captain's eyes bore into him. "We also found scratches on your car, Dan. Scratches that matched the height and placement of Jimmy's vehicle. Care to explain?" Dan swallowed hard, his mind racing for an explanation. "It must have happened when I parked near him earlier that day. He was always parking too close." The captain's expression remained unreadable. "We'll be running a full analysis. I suggest you stay available for further questioning." Haunted by guilt, Dan found himself at Jimmy's grave one evening. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of decaying leaves as he knelt by the headstone, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Jimmy," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I loved her. I thought if you were gone, she'd see me, choose me. But I didn't think it would end like this." Unbeknownst to Dan, Sarah had followed him. She stood a few feet away, hidden by the shadows of a nearby tree. Her heart pounded as she processed his words, her body frozen with shock. When Dan finally rose and left, Sarah emerged from her hiding spot, her mind a whirlwind of rage and betrayal. She had trusted him. Tommy had trusted him. And now she knew the truth. Back at home, Sarah moved mechanically, her expression blank as she located Jimmy's gun, stored safely in the box where he had always kept it. Tommy was at her mother's Sarah house for the night, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the weight of her decision. When Dan arrived later that evening, Sarah greeted him with an eerie calmness. He smiled, relieved to see her, and stepped inside. "Sarah, I've been meaning to talk to you," he began. I know," she interrupted, her voice cold. Dan frowned, sensing something was off. "You know what?" "That you killed Jimmy," she said, her tone icy and unyielding. Dan's blood ran cold. "Sarah, don't," she snapped, raising the gun she had hidden behind her back. Her hands trembled, but her aim was steady. "Don't lie to me. I heard you at the grave. You took him from me. From Tommy." "Sarah, please," Dan pleaded, stepping forward cautiously. "I never meant to hurt you. I loved you. I still do." "Love," she spat, tears streaming down her face. You think this is love? You destroyed my family, Dan. My son's father. Sarah, listen to me. Dan's voice broke, but he didn't have a chance to finish. He quickly ran to Sarah, grabbed her hand to take the gun, but Sarah pulled the trigger and shot herself. Her lifeless body fell to the floor. Dan's heart stopped. He had just killed his love, the woman he wanted to spend his whole life with, and now she was dead. Dead as were his dreams for the future. In desperation, he called the police and confessed to all the crimes he had committed. The police instantly arrested the killer. After some time the trial took place, Dan Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dan was faced with the consequences of his choice. In the end, the lives of all participants were irrevocably destroyed, torn apart by love, jealousy, and betrayal.